Same arrangement as always. It's a good price. Take it.
What did you pay last year?
Market price.
And this year?
Market price.
Keep it, we are not selling.
In September 1937, 7 European corporations held a private meeting and agreed on a number. The number was wrong. And by the time they understood how wrong, it was already too late to fix it. Archive 10. The Cartel Breaker. In the morning of October 4th, 1937, every cocoa farm in the Gold Coast colony went silent at the same moment. Not one bag moved, not one scale was touched, not one transaction was recorded. And it would stay that way for 153 consecutive days until 7 of the most powerful corporations in the global chocolate industry had no choice left but to surrender. The Gold Coast colony in 1937 sat on something that all of Europe needed and none of it could replace. 40% of the world's entire cocoa supply came from this one territory. Not 40% of British supply, not 40% of Africa's, 40% of everything. Every chocolate factory from Brussels to Birmingham ran on what these farms grew. There was no backup, there was no alternative source on any timeline that mattered. Europe needed the Gold Coast, and the Gold Coast knew it, and nobody with actual power had ever let them use that knowledge. The 7 companies that bought this cocoa, supply chains connected to Cadbury Brothers, Rowntree, and 5 allied European houses, had spent decades competing against each other for the harvest. That competition cost them money. In the summer of 1937, they ended it privately. They called the arrangement a buying pool. Every firm agreed to a single fixed maximum purchase price. No bidding, no competition, one ceiling. Whatever the ceiling said, that was what the farmer got. And if the farmer didn't like it, the farmer sold to nobody because nobody else was permitted to bid. The ceiling they set for the 1937 harvest was 40% below the year before. Their financial projections were clean. No alternative buyers, the pool had sealed that. The cocoa was perishable, it couldn't wait forever. The farmers had no financial reserves that could absorb weeks without income. The cartel had modeled every pressure point and arrived at a single number: 30 days maximum. They had run this kind of calculation before. It had always been right. It had never run into John Kwame Ayew.
We must be united in this choice.
Ayew didn't call a meeting in a formal hall. He didn't file paperwork or form a union or write a single binding document. He walked the footpaths between farms. He sat with the village chiefs. He moved through the market networks that had been running between these communities for generations before any European buying firm had set up a scale in the territory. He asked one question everywhere he went: what do you need to hold? What the cartel had no variable for was the economic architecture underneath the social one. These weren't isolated individuals making individual financial calculations. They were members of communities where your word was your credit, where your neighbors knew every decision you made, where reputation was the only currency that outlasted a season. To break the holdup wasn't just a financial choice, it was a community one. And the cost of that choice would be paid every day for the rest of your life in the place where you lived. The cartel was running standard pressure theory. Apply enough individual economic strain to enough participants and the collective collapses, because defecting is always cheaper for the individual, even when it's catastrophic for the group. This is called the prisoner's dilemma, and it is the foundational tool of every cartel that has ever tried to break a collective action. They needed 15% of farmers to sell privately. With 150,000 farmers under pressure, the math was supposed to be inevitable. Ayew had made the math irrelevant before the holdup started. The debt you'd carry by breaking, in a village where everyone knows everything, was larger than anything the cartel could put in your hand. October became November. Ships sat empty in Gold Coast harbors. Buying agents sent urgent dispatches to London. The cartel extended its deadlines. The harvest stayed in the warehouses. The first Belgian factory began drawing on reserve stocks. November became December. European factory reserves were down 30%. Emergency sessions were called. There was frustration. There was still certainty. The math was going to work. They just needed more time. But every week that passed was a week of compounding loss for the cartel. Idle ships, idle factories, workers being paid in Europe for machinery that wasn't running. The cartel thought it was applying pressure to the farmers. It was applying pressure to itself. And the farmers were doing nothing except standing still. Those were not the same situation. By late January 1938, the cartel's correspondence had a different quality to it. They moved to direct instruments. First, legal pressure. Agents arrived at farms with documents, breach of contract claims, pre-existing sale obligations, legal consequences under colonial law. The full architecture of institutional authority delivered in person, in writing, at the farm gate. Ayew had briefed every signatory on exactly what to expect. The documents were without enforceable foundation. The farmers set them on the ground and kept walking. Second, the individual offer, the precision instrument. Private agents visited individual farmers, not cooperative leadership, not village elders, but the specific man at his own gate, alone, with a confidential contract and cash above the embargo price, paid before anyone would know. The cartel just needed 15%. They had used this instrument in other markets. It had always cracked the collective, every single time. The defection rate across 4 months of individual private offers under maximum economic pressure, less than 2%. The social infrastructure held, not because the farmers felt nothing. Some families were eating on credit, some had nothing coming in for months. The cartel was offering real money in hand, and less than 2% took it, because the community around each of those men was not a sentiment, it was a structure. It was the thing that got you through a bad season, stood beside you when you were sick, made daily life possible. Breaking it meant leaving it, and no contract the cartel could write was worth the price of leaving it. February 1938. Factory production across Belgium and Britain was running below capacity. European retail shelves showed gaps in chocolate sections for the first time in memory. The industry press had begun asking questions that had no comfortable answers. The cartel's internal communications from this period read, in sequence, like a clinical chart of an organization losing its nerve. October, confident. November, cautious. December, concerned. January, alarmed. February, something past, alarmed. They had built a trap and walked into it. The trap was structural. The cartel's leverage had depended entirely on the farmers having nowhere else to go. What they had never modeled was the mirror. The cartel had nowhere else to go either. No other territory could supply 40% of global cocoa on any workable timeline. Every week the holdup continued, the costs compounded on the cartel's side, idle shipping contracts, factory overhead, retail shortfalls, while the farmers' only cost was waiting. The cartel was hemorrhaging, the farmers were standing still. Those two things were not symmetrical. One side had nothing to lose by holding, the other side was losing more every single day. March 7th, 1938, day 153. The buying pool issued its formal dissolution statement. The price ceiling was terminated. All 7 member firms returned to individual competitive bidding for Gold Coast cocoa. The farmers received fair market prices for the 1937 harvest, the same harvest that had been sitting in their warehouses for 5 months while Europe waited. John Kwame Ayew had organized 200,000 people with no contracts, no union, no legal protection, and no enforcement mechanism, held them against 7 of the most powerful corporate buyers in the world for 153 days, and extracted a complete, unconditional capitulation. The first ships loaded at the Gold Coast docks after the settlement carried cocoa purchased at honest weight and honest price. The trading post scales read correctly for the first time in years. What the cartel had was a monopoly built on the assumption that the supply was powerless. What Ayew had built was the opposite, a collective monopoly of the supply side, held together not by law or contract, but by the one thing the cartel's financial models had never assigned a value to: the weight of what it means to live inside a community and be known by it. They priced every variable they could find. They never priced that one. The Gold Coast cocoa holdup predated Ghanaian independence by 19 years. It had no political cover, no legal protection, no institutional support. What it had was 200,000 people who understood that their most powerful asset was not the crop. It was each other. Archive 10, The Cartel Breaker. The record is confirmed. This is Primal Vellum. We document what others dismiss. Follow the archive.
Some things were buried, but nothing is ever forgotten. It is only misfiled.
Primal Vellum, where myth becomes memory.